And welcome back to Moving Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie. Joining me as always is Nora St. John. Good morning there, Nora.
Good morning, Brian. How are you today?
Doing good, doing good. How about yourself?
Very well, thank you. California's having a lovely, what would I say? A lovely, like we've had a very cool summer so far, which has been great. And then there was apparently an earthquake in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there was a few big waves along this west coast here in the middle of the night, but I think that's all that happened. So that's a good thing.
Yeah.
That's a good
I
thing.
woke up to that and going, okay, because coming from Hawaii, I'm used to tsunamis. So it's got one of those
Yeah.
things that it's like, okay, funny story. I remember going when I was in college, going to school, University of Hawaii, and nobody was at school. The place was deserted.
Oh,
And I
oh.
just woken up and I, was like, oh, gotta
Yeah,
get to
yeah,
class,
yeah.
and rode my bike and I'm looking around going, nobody's here. It was like I was deserted. And I got to
Ooh.
class and there was one person walking the hall. I said, what's going on? They said, oh, tsunami, class is canceled. I said, oh, cool. Where did everybody go? To the beach. It's just that natural reaction. Day out of school, we're going to the beach. And it wasn't until that big tsunami hit, what was it, Bali, or hit somewhere in the South Pacific that we
Yeah,
began taking things
2001,
a
I think.
lot more seriously, because at that time it was sort of like,
Yeah.
and University of Hawaii is in the mountains. It's literally in the valley. It's in Manoa Valley in the mountains. So we're like, it's never going to hit here, but still
Yeah.
better safe than sorry. They, close every, thing. So yeah. So when we have tsunamis, it was always surfs up. So now they take it a little more seriously. And, I got to call my family. And from what I heard, there were about 6 foot waves above normal. So good size, but nothing
Yeah.
dangerous yet. So
Yeah.
luckily, but yeah, I woke up to that too. And the news going, ooh, all right, I better check with my family and make sure everything's all right. Okay. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It was just one of those like, tsunami. Giant. Oh, okay. There we go. The world,
Exactly.
nature, right? Nature. Things
Yeah.
happen.
Exactly. Can't control that. Can't control that.
No,
Before we get
indeed.
started today, we have a really interesting topic. Before we get started, though, hit that like and subscribe button. We really appreciate it. You can best get in touch with us through our Gmail account, movingconvos@gmail.com, or check us out on Instagram, Moving Combos. You can always DM us there, and I will, answer any questions you might have. And we'd love to hear from you, especially if you have any topics you'd love us to cover. Every time someone sends us something, it's like, ooh, cool. We'll cover that one, next week. So yeah. And we're going to be on the road pretty soon, you and I. Where are we heading?
We are. We're going to be at Blue Moon Pilates in Mission Viejo, California, teaching a couple of different workshops. So we're going to teach a whole day workshop on Saturday on the low back and how to work with the low back in both the personal training and the Pilates environment. You get a lot of practical tips. So do a little bit of theory and then a lot of just how do you look at the back? How do you look at the body? How do you adjust this exercise for different conditions? Then on the next day, on Sunday, we're going to be doing something on the shoulder and something on osteoporosis. This is September 12th and 13th. Save your calendar, save your dates, and come on and see us.
We'd love to see you. This is going to be a lot of fun. And like we said, on an audio format, we can only do so much. So a lot of what we talk about is theoretical. It's a lot of the science kind of stuff and some conjecture, but a lot of the science. This is a lot of practical, everything from assessment all the way to practical. You've got a client in front of you. What do you do when you see a certain thing? So come on down. We'd love to see you. People are signing up. We're getting notifications, people saying, hey, I'm going to be there. So can't wait to meet you guys in person. So that'll be a lot of fun. But today's topic, why don't you introduce it? Because you were the one I texted you last night and I was like, what do you want to talk about? So, and you came up with this and I love the thought process behind it.
So we're talking about the glute and hamstring connection, kind of the whole posterior chain and how we work with it or don't work with it. And part of this came up because more than once I've seen headlines or like a little workshop title that says, the glutes are your solution to low back pain. Yep. And I'm kind of like, well, that's not been my experience entirely, right? Sometimes, yes, absolutely. You've got a sleepy butt syndrome where the glutes aren't firing at all, and that will decrease the stability of that whole back chain. But I think it's more complicated than that. It's more complicated than just strengthen the glutes and everything will be fine. Some of my clients have really overactive glutes, and that tends to decrease core activation, other kinds of things. Other clients really don't have a good balance between glutes and hamstrings. Some of them are compensating with the glutes for tight hip flexors, all kinds of things. We just wanted to dive into this topic with a little more refinement than you often see out there.
I think what it is for a lot of people, we want to simplify. And people have a
Yeah,
natural tendency to say, the glutes are the key. They're one of the keys. Let's just think of it as a series of locks, not just a single lock.
yes,
So it's
absolutely.
and I've had a lot of success working with clients when they have had dormant butt syndrome, gluteal amnesia, whatever you want to call it, where you say, okay, we need to get this to fire and fire correctly. So you're not only using your hamstrings, and that can be one of the keys to progressing that. However, it's not the end all be all. It's not just the glutes. It's a series of things that can help. And also, as you said, when someone has overly tightened glutes or their
Yeah.
glutes are dominant, that can also lead to issues.
Yeah, and it can lead to low back issues. So
Yeah.
I've seen just as many clients with low back pain who have overactive glutes as underactive glutes. So it's just a matter
Well,
of, again, just creating a whole balance, or that whole back chain is really kind of what we're looking for.
I remember when I was teaching in Seattle, I had a gentleman come with his girlfriend, fiance, wife, whatever she was. And she came up to me and she said, "We have a question for you." And this
We
man
have
was
a question
built
for you.
like a brick outhouse. I mean, he was ripped to shreds. His body looked like what everybody wants their body to look like in fitness, sort of thing. It was
Yeah.
perfect and perfect bodybuilder type body. And he's been having low back pain. He's been having numbness and tingling down his legs. Da 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 da. Da.
Mm.
Said, okay. Started talking, and I looked at him and watching him while I'm talking to him. I said, first of all, do you always stand there and squeeze your glutes constantly?
Yeah.
And his eyes opened up, and he goes, yeah. And I said, well, knock it off. I said,
Right. Start with this.
relax your butt. And as soon as he
Yeah.
did that, he goes, oh, yeah.
Uh,
The numbness down my legs stopped. I said, exactly. I said, you're squeezing too much. It's okay to have a little bit of tonicity, to have some tone in your rear end. However, you've taken that to an extreme. And she was great. She was like, told you, wacky, and say, stop squeezing your butt. She used the language that was a little bit more, choice than that, but
oh.
I was laughing my butt off. So yes, it can actually cause issues as well.
That's actually a great example. I want to bring up another case study before we get started, because that's partly what I was thinking about this for. Is I've got a client, and this is something that I have found more than once, and it's something that I'm just thinking about in terms of how all this works, is clients who have limited range of motion and hip extension.
Mm.
So whether that's structural, whether that's how the joints are arranged, whether they just have a tight, joint capsule, whether they have super tight hip flexors, like whatever the issue is, like some clients just really barely have a full neutral position in hip extension. In other words,
Mhm.
if they're going to try to stand just straight up with their femur over their, or their pelvis over their femur, they might even be a little bit anteriorly tilted, because they can't actually get into a neutral position with that femur. That's not
Mhm.
uncommon.
No.
And so I've got, one client, several clients that I've worked with, but a couple of clients I can think of where that was the issue. So for both of them, they were overusing the glutes because that was the only way they could get into hip extension.
Yeah.
So just one of those things to bring up. Like, and then I've had other clients who have gluteal amnesia because they have so much range of motion, hip extension, that they don't really even need to use their glutes to get, like, let's say, just a basic gait action, right? A basic swing in terms of gait. So I think there's a lot to do with what the hip structure is, the range of motion and hip flexion and extension, and then how those muscles are working or not working.
And also timing, I find, is also very important
Yeah,
depending on what you're
yeah,
doing,
yeah.
because timing, depending on the action you're asking your glutes to perform, that can really be a lot of people say, well, they have to fire first. So we'll get into timing issues as well, because I find that can also be part of the issue.
Right. So tell me why people say they have to fire first. I've had this discussion
Mhm.
with more than one physical therapist in something like, let's say, a bridge exercise that they have to squeeze the glutes first. And I don't always find that that's true. But let me, like, if can you explain the reasoning for that? Because I've it's not been my experience. So I'm just thinking about it.
Yeah, I think what it is for a lot of people who have gluteal amnesia that I've encountered, and from what I've read in the literature, the hamstrings are overactive. So they're firing first. They're firing and they're dominant. And a lot of times they take over because they can produce hip extension. So whether they're doing a bridge, whether they're doing gait, whatever they're doing, the hamstrings are really taking over. And so their glutes aren't firing until way late in the pattern, if at all. Because I've had a number of people go up into a bridge and you can feel their glutes and it is saggy. There's nothing going
Nothing
on there.
happening.
Nothing happening, or one side is and the other isn't. So we've seen that, and a lot of times we can see that pelvic obliquity where one hip is dropping down in a bridge or whatnot. So I can understand their thought process that we want it to get fire. We want it to fire.
Right.
However, I find that it does fire first in terminal hip extension when it's behind the body. Now, I'm going to break this down into what I always heard as kinesiological, body movement. Okay. Flexion is anything from neutral, where the leg is straight down, to bringing the knee up. Extension
Right.
is anything from the knee in a raised position to back down to neutral.
Oh,
Hyperextension is anywhere behind neutral.
okay. Which
Now,
is
and I
there's different definitions always on that.
absolutely.
So, but we'll go with that for these purposes.
I'm just
Perfect.
I'm just
Yeah, yeah.
I divide it like that because what I see is this: when you're in a terminal hip extension into that hyperextension where your leg is behind your body, your glute is going to be firing quite extensively. It's going to want to fire. And that's where a lot of times I will use that position to wake up the glutes, put them in that
Mhm.
position and get them to fire and hold it so we can work on a little bit of endurance into that position. However, for me, from a kinesiological standpoint, I find that the glutes are most active and most dominant. They're in a functional standpoint when they're actually slowing us down, when we're going into like a gait or a lunge or a stepping forward, that they're actually stopping our progression of our body continuing to move forward. They're actually, if you're going to do a
Mm.
forward lunge and land on that foot, your glute is what's woeing you up. That's the one saying, okay, I got it, and slowing you down. So for me, I take it from both
Good.
standpoints. I like the functional aspect in that it's in front of my body, to that terminal where I often use to wake it up. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah. And what I liked about what you said was thinking about, and got more to say on that in a minute, but just thinking about again, where is that hip? What is it doing and when is it firing? Just
Mhm.
as a basic thing. Yeah. And I like that idea of when does it have to fire? And both actively in something like the push-off phase of gait, right? That last terminal hip
Mhm.
extension of gait, but also for you, almost the eccentric phase of
Yes.
slowing you down. Right. I
100%.
appreciated that because I hadn't thought about that piece of it. And that comes into play too in something like a deadlift, right? A
Mhm.
forward fold and then coming back up. Like there's that eccentric phase of keeping you from falling over. Even in a
Yes.
squat, there's a certain amount of eccentric phase controlling that down and that up, right?
100%. 100%.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
So I think that's a good way to think about that.
to me, it's always based on two different things. One is functional movement and the
Yeah.
other is activation.
Okay. Yep.
So when I think of activation, I need to get it woken up. So I remember one client, I had her over a ball and taking her leg into hip extension, stabilizing at the core, lifting her leg and holding that position. One glute fired with no problem. The leg was nice and straight. The other leg bent the knee, went into extension. Her glutes were off. I mean, literally, I'm thumping it, trying to get them to wait. There's nothing there. And she's laughing, thinking, why is and I said, your glutes just not turned on. We have to get it firing again. So we worked on it. It took us about 2 weeks. And then finally she said, I can feel it. But it did take a long time for her. When she started feeling it, it was like, okay, we got it activated. Then I could progress her to a more functional environment where she could do something like a lunge and not have the hamstrings try and take over, where she could try and do something like a squat or just standing up and sitting down, something very simple. She was in her mid to late 40s, so it wasn't like I was working with an elderly person. It was someone with back issues. But standing up and sitting down, she could get her glutes firing again and controlling the eccentric phase rather than just plop, as she
Yeah,
sits
exactly.
down,
It
which
just
a
fall
lot of
down.
people
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
So I try and think of those two things: functionality, functional movement, and activation. They're different in my mind. They're very different. And I don't like a bridge necessarily for activation because the hamstrings, you're in a bent knee position. The hamstrings are
Yeah.
already shortened.
They're gonna be active. Yeah.
They're going to be active. They're going to be really active. So saying don't use your hamstrings, which I've heard a lot of people say, whether it be physical therapists or other, fitness people, they're going to be active. They're both responsible for hip extension. They're going to be active.
Right, right. They're going to be going. You can't move the joint into certain ranges and not have the muscles that control that do something, even if it's at a very low level. Right.
Yes.
It's like if I'm bending my elbow, my biceps, my brachialis, and other things are working
Yep.
at different levels and in different proportions and whatever, but the muscle's shortening because that joint is changing position. Yeah. So couple things. One is thinking about glute amnesia. Just let's start kind of with that concept. So I liked your example perfectly, right? Hanging over the ball, lift the leg up, and there's just nothing firing there. That the leg is going into hip extension, but there's nothing happening with that particular glute. One way that I've played with this with clients, very simple, is what I call butt popcorn.
Yeah.
So, right, just sitting on a chair and just squeeze your butt. And do you get taller or do you not get taller? And then trying to have them do like right leg, right butt, left butt, right butt, left butt. And oftentimes you'll find that they can't do one, the other, or both. Like you say, squeeze your glutes, and they just look at you like, what are you talking about? And there's not any activation there. So that for me is like my first version. Obviously, something a little more loaded, like you did over the ball, or something like that, is another place where you're going to feel that really obviously. Bridging is another place that's kind of nice to say, because they can actually even get their hands underneath their butt on a bridge, so they can actually feel if their butt's working. But popcorn they can too, because they can have kind of their hands underneath their hips and they can feel like, is something firing underneath my hands? So again, activation is often step one, as you mentioned with your client. But if they can't fire that, then you can have them do a million exercises and it's never going to go. You got to wake it up. One other thing though that I wanted to talk about with that is where in hip extension the glutes fire. Because that I find varies wildly.
I was gonna say, I've never read anything that was so specific saying it's within this range of motion that it fires the greatest or that it begins to fire. It's all over the map.
And it depends on that person's range of motion and hip extension. So like, as I was mentioning, my client has very limited hip extension. And how I see that in Pilates, just as a moment here, is let's say supine on the trap table, feet in straps. Okay, so feet in strap, pulling the leg down. She gets to a certain point and it's not very close to the table and her knee bends to get the strap down farther. And she can't actually get her femur down any farther without anteriorly tilting her pelvis. Does that make sense? So I'm pulling the leg down and basically in order to compensate for the lack of hip extension, she'll go into knee flexion.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's just one little sign that I saw. But the other thing too is on the other side of that, I've had many instructors in both personal training and Pilates, and I'm particularly thinking about on the Coraline with Jonathan Hoffman, which are like, okay, just let's say you're doing, pushing that leg back, like you're doing a scooter exercise, or you're doing kind of a lunge exercise on a moving piece of equipment, right? Where you're standing on one leg, the other leg is pushing back behind you with a bent knee. And if you have a lot of range of motion in hip extension, you may not get your glutes to fire till way towards the end of that motion, way past neutral.
Yes.
And many, many, many people that I've talked to and worked with and been in workshops with say, okay, so just go to neutral and come back, and go to neutral and come back. I know for myself and for many clients that have range of motion there, they go to neutral, their glutes do not fire at neutral. Yeah. So a lot of it for me is figuring out where in that arc that glute does fire and then trying to activate it there.
Yeah, I was doing leg stretch with someone earlier this morning, and he's got a history of low back issues, huge history, but his range of motion was unbelievable when he went back. He extended back. I'm looking, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, it was all coming from his lumbar spine. His pelvis and lumbar
Oh,
spine
yeah.
was really
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
overcompensating.
Yeah,
And it was a challenge to try and get him to have more of a neutral spine, neutral pelvis, so he would
right.
feel the stretch in the hip flexor and to try and get the glute engaged. And it was one of those things that I was like, you know what? I'm going to find a better exercise because he would just fall into it and
Right.
he wasn't really
He would just
feeling anything.
dip into lumbar extension. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. So it was like, okay, there's better things that we can try that are going to, I hate to use the word lock at his pelvis, but get him into a more neutral state within his lumbar spine and his pelvis so we could focus much more on the hip flexor and the glute.
And that's a classic reason for low back pain. Actually, sort of in both directions. If
Yeah.
somebody has no range of motion hip extension, they're going to take that extension into their lumbar when they just have pushing their leg behind them, right? Just like
Yep.
that's what's going to happen because the hip can't go, so the low back's going to go, and that's going to cause probably more motion and more potential compression in the lumbar than somebody who has more normal range of motion.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. So it was interesting working with that and really seeing how everybody does have differences in where their hip extension is and when that glute wants to fire. Because I know you and I have very different body types. And because of your dance background, and I'm fairly flexible for a male, but still nowhere near where you might be. So really, when you're looking at the client in front of you, we really have to take a look at, okay, where is their glute firing? Where does it want to fire? Where does it want to become active? Because for some people, you're going to find that. But at the same time, I find if you're not careful in keeping that neutral state in their lumbar and pelvis, where it's not going to go into a big lordosis.
Yeah.
If you're not keeping that, you're really going to be dumping into the low back. And that's when you can actually bypass the glute almost and do a lot of hip extension, even in a quadruped position, hands and knees, or over a ball, because they're just dumping directly into their lumbar spine.
Right. This is that classic situation where a neutral lumbopelvic position, lumbopelvic, both position is
Yep.
really critical for understanding and working with that hip extension piece. Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes you want to combine the two. If you're doing a swan or you're doing something full back chain, that's great, or back extension. But if you're not, then really working on how do you figure out just what that motion of the hip is capable of, and then how do you activate it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So thinking about, like, let's just take an example of a bridge. And
Mhm.
I'm gonna, in fact, stand up, everybody, if you're willing. Okay, if you're driving, don't stand up. But
Yeah.
you get the idea. When you're not standing up, try this for a minute. One of the things that I work on a lot, and this is particularly in terms of the functional piece, is having people just stand up, and from the standing position, let's say they're going to start walking around the room. So start just take a walk, and then really put your fingers on your butt and notice when it fires. Okay, and notice if it fires, and kind of then
Yep.
when it fires. If you are a nosy porker like I kind of am, and I wander and I look at a lot of people moving all the time, I'm kind of like, oh, what's happening with their hips? Are their glutes moving? Are they activating that? Do they have hip extension? Like, those are just things I notice on people when I'm walking around. And then so pause for a moment then, and just from a standing position, uh, extend one hip. Don't lose the lower back. Don't dump into the lower back. Keep the low back stable, the pelvis stable. They're not moving, but extend that hip. And then notice where in that action the glutes fire, just from a standing position. You can also do this like prone on the ball or prone on a box, or something where you can start with the hip in slight flexion. That also works really well there. And then notice when or if it fires. To Brian's point, it didn't fire very well with the ball. Then what I suggest is, first of all, just know what it does, because I always like to know the client, well, what is it doing when they're not thinking about it? Then the second thing I sometimes like to do is have them squeeze their glutes first and then go into hip extension. Because what they'll usually notice is their range of motion is significantly decreased, potentially. And
Mhm.
so if I'm working with a client where I'm trying to increase range of motion hip extension, I actually want them to have the hamstrings start that hip extension and the glutes to come in towards terminal hip extension, not earlier
Mhm.
on, because that's going to give them bigger range of motion in that hip extension,
Yep.
if that's a goal, right?
And
So
what you
anyway,
just
just throw that out
said
there.
is important. Range of motion. There are many different types of walks. And if you're just
Yes,
walking around the room, okay, you're probably doing what I would refer to as a mall walk. You don't have a big range of motion. You're more
right.
of
It's a
wandering.
saunter.
It's a saunter. You're not taking a
Okay, and I
large
like,
range of motion.
yeah,
So you're not going into much hip extension. Those glutes are
right.
not going to want to fire. They're just not going to. Whereas if you have more of a focused walk, a longer gait, more range of motion, your glutes actually
Going
have an
somewhere.
opportunity. Yeah. And I
Yeah,
will tell, people sometimes with urgency, you want to move
yes,
with urgency or
yep,
with focus.
yeah.
And then you can see, oh, it starts to fire. So when people say, well, I went out for a walk and I said, okay, how were you walking? Oh, I was walking my dog, and I happen to know they have a tiny dog. I was like, okay, you're not walking very fast.
No.
You're just not.
Yeah,
However, if you're out doing a really focused walk and you're really picking up your pace a little bit, you can actually get more of that hip extension into it. So I think range of motion in the walk has a lot to do with it as well. And I don't think a lot of us use our glutes on a regular basis when we're just walking around the house or in the grocery store or to our car or something,
no.
unless we're running behind.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point, right? So just are they firing, are they not firing, and are they firing in a functional way? Um, yeah, exactly. So thinking about what they're doing when they're doing it and how they're doing it. Um, one of the things that I'll often encourage people to do is if they are taking up walking, let's say they're really like walking is their maybe not necessarily their cardio, but it's like that's the thing that they do a lot of. Maybe they're a hiker, maybe they just,
Mhm.
walking, like they walk a certain number of miles a day just to get their steps in and stuff. I'll say, okay, so think about when you're firing those glutes. And even for like a block or two or half a block or three houses or whatever your measurements are, two trees, um, activate those glutes a little more strongly as you're
Mhm.
pushing off and in that terminal phase. And when I work with clients like that, they say, gosh, I go so much faster,
Yep.
right? They find like their speed increases quite a bit with that kind of simple cue of add that glute engagement towards the end of that push off phase.
Yeah. I see the same thing. The other thing I want to say when I have clients do that focused walk, first of all, you said it correctly. Give them a specific length. Do not say for your whole walk, focus on your glute. Because I've
Yeah,
actually had OCD clients that every single step they're squeezing their butt, and by the end of the walk,
yeah,
they've
they got trouble.
overactivated everything. They've got trouble. Their back is way messed up. So give them like telephone pole to telephone pole, mailbox to mailbox, something small,
Yeah,
and then forget it. Do it
yeah,
for 10
exactly.
seconds and forget it. Do it for 10 seconds and forget it.
Do three
Now,
times during a 2 mile
a
walk,
walk.
whatever. Yeah, yeah,
Exactly. Give them specifics because some people really need those specifics. So that I highly recommend that. The second thing is what I found in cueing people sometimes is not necessarily having them focus on their glute, but on their toe push off. Because
yeah,
once they get into the, and I'll say push off through your big toe if they don't have big toe issues. Okay, push off through your big toe. And what I find is most people don't actually get that full extension on their foot, that, or I should say, their
yeah.
plantar
That push
flexion,
off. Yeah, yeah,
and they're not
absolutely.
extending through the toes. So they're not getting that push off. And if they're not getting that push off, their glutes not getting really into the position where it can fire strongest.
Uh
So I'll
huh.
sometimes say focus
Good.
on the toes because people can feel that. It's kind of like you can feel your fingers, you can feel your toes. Feeling your glutes,
Yes.
50-50. Not everybody can do it.
Yeah.
But little longer stride, focus on your toes, pushing off through your toes, and I'll find that their glutes will fire a little bit better. So just something that I've
Yeah.
discovered over the years.
Great. And this is like if you're in a gym setting or if a client does things like let's say on a treadmill, right? If they've got that kind of thing as part of their workout, that's a really nice place to work on some of this. Because you can
Yeah.
set the pace, you can set the pace of the treadmill. You can do this walking too, but treadmill is a really nice way to do that. And then you've got your timer there, you've got all your metrics. So, every 5 minutes, let's say you do 30 seconds of thinking about that stride length, or
Yep.
thinking about your toe push off. And then you forget about it for 4 minutes, and then you do another minute or whatever it is. So that's another really nice way to do that too, if somebody, tends to work on a treadmill.
Yeah.
One other thing I wanted to bring up here in terms of this is, very often, again, we are trying to get the glutes to fire appropriately, because a sleepy glute will cause stress on the back, either
Hmm.
through, well, through all kinds of things, but just basically not connecting that whole posterior chain so that the glutes, the hamstrings, and the erector spinae are not firing in an appropriate pathway. On the other hand, and I wanted to bring this up too, I've got a client, for example, who overuses the glutes. Like, the glutes are their
Yes.
stabilizer. They use them as their core. They use them as, like you were talking about the client at the beginning, like the thing that holds them together.
Yes.
Right. So in other words, like when they're just standing around, their glutes are in high tone, just
Always.
standing. Now, sometimes that is, again, that can be because they don't have enough hip extension in their
Hmm.
structure, and they have to actually do that just to keep themselves upright. So there is structural stuff there. And then you want to work on length, and you want to work on lengthening out the hip flexors a bit, so you've got the range of motion for them to be able to support themselves in an upright position.
Yeah.
But otherwise, like in working with those clients, getting them to not be glute clenchers, as I think you probably worked on. Well, you just gave him a couple
Oh,
of
yeah.
comments, but that's another really big challenge, because then where else do they get their stability from?
Yep.
Right? If that's really kind of what they're holding themselves together with, then I often find that that means that they have substituted glutes for abdominals. Like, their abdominals are often not
Bingo.
very strong. And they also kind of substituted glutes for, even like, the front of their hips are not working either. So very often what I've got to get them to do is things like curls, things like crunches, things like roll downs, where even in a roll down, and I feel like I'm being very wordy today, so shut me up, Brian, if I am being. But anyway, go doing a roll down. Right, a lot of times, if you're doing a roll down in Pilates on the short box or on the trap table or the Cadillac, right, you have to, depending on the shape of your glute, you have to use a certain amount of glute tuck to get the butt out of the way to be able to roll down and maintain lumbar flexion. But a whole lot of clients who are glute clenchers just keep that tension the whole time and never let it go. So finding that's a place where I work a lot on finding appropriate amount of glute tone, just to kind of get things out of the way, but then have the abdominals do as much of the work as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something else to think about in the fitness world, for instance, years ago, we were taught to squeeze our butt with almost every exercise. Okay.
Yeah.
In a
Yeah.
squat, when you're standing up, I still see this. I have clients who come to me and I have them do a squat. They stand up and they automatically squeeze their butt at the top. I'm like, stop it. You don't need to do that in daily life. There's no reason for it whatsoever. It's not going to firm you up anymore. It's not going to
Right.
transfer into
Yes.
any power or
Yes.
anything else. So there's those old patterns that I do still see that people still do. And we got to somewhat break people of those habits. Now, the other thing you were saying is people who are using those instead of their core. I find people are still cueing that with things like planks, squeeze your butt.
Mm,
So they go into that position.
right.
And if everybody stands up for a moment and just squeeze your butt, what do you notice? You go automatically into a posterior pelvic tilt. You
Right.
automatically sort of shut that down and close off the posterior wall of the pelvis, which,
Yep.
if that's your goal for whatever reason, fine. Okay. However, in in a case of, think of it as bracing for the lower body, you're basically just tightening everything up and not letting it go because I have to hold on for
Yeah.
dear life. In a good plank, your body should be able to hold everything together as much as it needs to for that moment. You shouldn't have to manually tighten every single piece.
Yes,
And
exactly.
I still hear people say that and cue that. And I want, if you are cueing it that way, please back off a little bit from that. You want them to work as hard as they need to maintain the position properly, but they don't need to hold everything together for dear life.
And I'm stepping into some very, very muddy waters here. So just let me step into this. One of the cues that both Ron Fletcher used and Romana used in Pilates land a lot was, like, imagine you're holding, a dollar bill between your butt cheeks. don't lose that dollar bill. Like for a
Yep.
lot of exercises, like that was a very common cue in footwork and bridging and other kinds of things. And that's that same situation. Is it's like you, like with everything, you want to use it as much as you need to use it to get the job done. I will also call out bar training.
Mm,
Traditional bar work is all about like the butt squeeze and the posterior tilt, and like you tuck your pelvis 800,000 times. The goal being to tone your butt. Okay, maybe,
yep.
but boy, can you overdo that. And that really does cause trouble with the low back. It causes trouble with the pelvic floor. It can deactivate the core. It can stress out the hips. Like moderation. Again, moderation,
Mhm.
all these things. You need strength there for sure. Some of that is great. 45 minutes of a class, which is a class I took fairly recently, was like, well, that was 45 minutes of a butt squeeze. Like, that's not really something my body needs, right? Like, that just wasn't appropriate for
Yeah.
anybody in that class, not just me. So those are some very common things in fitness and Pilates and bar. That is a way to think about getting the glutes stronger, like tone those suckers up. You got to find some moderation in that, ideally.
Yeah. And I think in general, with any body part, using something for as much as you need it for is a good way just to think about it for life, whether it's your core. If I have to stabilize my body because I'm pushing, you know, I'm pushing a car, I'm helping someone push a car, or I'm opening a stuck refrigerator or a cabinet that's not quite, and I have to really anchor my core in order to move it. My core has to be strong enough in order to do the job that I've asked it to.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with your glutes. If I'm training a higher level athlete who I need to have explosive strength, whether it be a martial artist or a sprinter or a football player, baseball player, someone who needs to come off the line, bang, go. Okay, I'm going to train them differently than I would because they're going to need that for that activity. I'm going to train them differently than I would for someone who's just wants to, play with their kids and go out to, cycle occasionally or whatnot. Those are different goals. So I always try and look at what do they need this muscle for?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's something we should always ask. Like,
Yeah.
what are they going to do with this? Because it varies wildly. I'm thinking about training young mothers postnatally, right, or
Mm.
in the early phases, and actually prenatally too. I say just take a 10-pound bag of rice and just hold it.
For 10
Seriously,
minutes.
for 10 minutes. Just hold it for 10 minutes. And just start that process of progressive weight training, because that is what your infant is going to provide for you.
Yep.
Like
Yep.
little things like that. But same thing with the glutes. Like, what do they need? Do they need just walking around glute strength? Do they need to be a jumper? I'm thinking about a basketball player or a dancer who needs to put powerful jumps. They
Yep.
need more active glutes than somebody who's just wandering about.
Yep.
So, yeah.
And that's why I always come back to functionality. To me, yes, 10 years ago, the F word in fitness was function. Everything was functional, but standing on a ball and balancing another ball on your head while juggling things, that's not functional. However, I do like things like lunges, step ups, squats, all of those type of things. So if I have someone that I need to activate their glutes and get them firing in a functional sense, I've already got the activation and I want to take them to that next level. That forward lunge, even if it's a small, it doesn't have to be a deep lunge. It can just be even just a forward step to return. It's that
Yeah.
deceleration, landing heel toe. If you land on your toe first, you take it in the patella. You're really going to be a lot of shear force on that knee. But when you land heel, the hamstring and glute fire together in the way that it's supposed to decelerate you. And then you can accelerate back to your standing position. And I find that that's a great way to start that process. And you can do it in a clock lunge, you can do a side lunge, you can do any of those. But I find that forward lunge really to decelerate, even much more so than even a squat, I find is a great way just to get that functionality and remind the glute, hey, this is what I need to do on a regular basis. Because every step I take, guess what? That glute has to not only propel me, but it also has to land on that forefoot and decelerate me to a certain degree as I do the swing phase of gait.
Nice. Nice. And so a couple things. One is there's an exercise done either on the suspension trainer, so Bodhi,
Mm.
Terex, whatever you've got, or you can also do it on a tower or a wall unit or whatever with just the straps in your hands, basically the springs in your hands. And that is basically going forward, like leaning forward into a lunge and then popping back up into your standing position with the foot off the ground. So
Yep.
kind of stepping forward into a lunge and coming back. And that's a wonderful exercise for that. I mean, I love that. I'll even do it just like leaning into a wall. So leaning forward into a wall and then pushing off the wall. So that's the other way to do
Mhm.
that. But those are some nice ways to get that idea of that dynamic nature of number one, finding posture forward, back, right, in a kind of
Mhm.
dynamic way. And number two, finding that, again, that glute activation in both directions, not just the glutes, but really that whole chain to work effectively to support you and hold you up.
And when you get into thinking about things from a functional standpoint, you said the word right there, the whole chain. It's the posterior chain. It's getting not
Yeah.
only the glutes. Remember, I said at the beginning, it's just one key, many locks. So we want the hamstrings to fire. We want our calf and our ankle to fire. We want our erector spinae to fire. We want everything to work together as much as they need and in proper timing so that we can support our body. And I love going back into a balance as well. I'll take that forward lunge into a 1 foot balance because it
Yeah.
really does require the standing leg also to really organize itself underneath you.
All the
So the
way.
leg that
Yeah.
all the way. So you're
I mean,
landing
from
on the
foot
front
up.
leg, you're coming back so that front leg gets the work, and then the back leg has to organize you as you're standing in good posture. And your erectors really have to organize you. And okay, got to hold this together. Oh, we're moving again. Oh, now we're holding together. It's a great way to get things working properly,
And working dynamically. So we've kind of started
dynamically.
out with activation, and just to kind of walk that back a little bit, or kind of put all these in context. So starting with activation, again, if you've got a sleepy
Mhm.
butt, you've got to wake it up.
Yes.
And again, you can play with different positions, different ranges of motion, different kinds of resistance. You can take the hamstrings out ish by not bending the knees. You can add the hamstrings more in by bending the knees. So
Yep.
there's a lot of ways, and a lot of times, especially for clients with limited hip extension, I start with them on, let's say, a ball, or even lying over a long box or over the edge of a trap table, so that the hip starts in flexion, and then they have
Yes.
to lift it up towards extension. Maybe they may get to neutral, they may lose something before they get to neutral. So that's a really nice place to just start with that, and thinking about, again, are those glutes firing? Are those glutes firing? Yes, they are. Good. Or not. Let's see if we can get that to happen.
Yeah.
And then adding in that timing of glutes and hamstrings, so when am I like hamstring? And then I go into the glute, and then I release the glutes and I go into the hamstrings in a bridge, for example.
Yep.
Or maybe I really want to get the glutes to fire first. Maybe they're so sleepy, they've got to go, and they've got to go
Mhm.
fast, and they've got to go on both sides. So
Yep.
that's also where I want to do single leg work. Like, again, laying over the ball, or to lift one leg up, that one's fine. This one, not so much. One other little
Yep.
piece of that is if you have a low back issue, and particularly if you have something like piriformis syndrome, or you have sciatica down one leg, that will often cause the glutes to go to sleep. So you
Mhm.
kind of got a chicken or egg there of, you got low back problems, which cause the butt to go to sleep, which then causes more low back problems. So, working on all those pieces.
I also find that doing the activation is fantastic, but I find that works best is working with endurance on that. So I'll put
Hmm.
them into a position where they are usually I prefer the ball, but I have used the table, I've used the box. So they are in a little bit of hip flexion to start, extend one leg back and only lift it up to the point where they're not losing their dynamic lumbopelvic stability, where that's staying put, where they can
Yep.
feel their glute and holding, holding, holding. Start at 5 seconds. Tap down, do the same leg again. And I'll do 5 repetitions, sometimes 10 repetitions. And what I find is by holding it, and I'll tell them, use your mind, get your brain
Yes,
involved.
exactly. Use your mind for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, because then they're like, okay. And so I'm basically telling them to squeeze it without saying squeeze. So I'm saying, get your mind involved. I want you to really feel that glute, feel that glute. I want you to contract it. And they'll start doing it. And I don't like the word squeeze because they get both sides involved. So I'll say, contract the glute, contract it. And then they'll get it. And you can see it in their eyes. They're like, I can feel it. And then we'll do both sides. Second set, third set. That's the magic set. especially the second one, because now their mind has that pathway. They know exactly how to contract it. Boom, they got it. And they're going to hold it. And you can see it get tight. And you can see after about 4 or 5 seconds, it's shaking. The whole leg is starting to shake. So I like working on endurance as well, rather than just popping it up and down, because there's something to that. But really getting that endurance firing really can get that activation, I find.
That also goes back to what we talked about in our last episode, which was about isometric and eccentric and concentric stuff, and the value of isometrics in building strength.
Yes.
Right? I mean, if you're holding that leg out there and those glutes are doing whatever they're doing for a longer period, you're getting that extra bit of strengthening because that's an isometric hold.
Yep.
Right. So that's another, I guess another piece back. If you haven't read that, heard that one, you should go back and listen to that one. It's full of all kinds of good tips and pointers.
So yeah, if you have someone who has that sleepy glute, that's where I always start. Always. And I also start them there, especially if they just need good spinal stability, because I want to make sure that it's firing. So I'll take them through an activation series. And if they're firing well, maybe that's all I'll do is that one time. Other times I'll find one side that's not firing as well. I just had a client today whose back has been bothering him a little bit more than usual. Well, guess what? I tested both sides and one side was a lot weaker than the other. I was like, okay, we need to just put a little bit more focus on the left, a little less on the right. And you can really see that. And you can sort of see, do they want to use the hamstring more because they're bending their knee? On that side, if they're bending their knee, that hamstring is trying to do the work. So make sure they straighten out the leg. But once you get that, then you can start taking them into more dynamic things. And that glute should be firing. And that's the whole thing. We want to get it to that point where it is firing in a dynamic sense.
Now, I'm gonna take us back a moment. So we've talked about getting it activated. We've talked about eccentric and concentric. So working with those phases, finding a range of motion with resistance, like for example, a single leg knee stretch on the reformer or a lunge stretch, where you're getting that activation going and finding the range where they get it to fire. Taking that into walking. So we've talked about a lot of pieces there. One other little piece of that I sometimes find is, how do we actually get them, let's say, well, actually, I'm going to take this back for a moment. Think about a bridge. If you've got clients in a bridge, I think about glutes and hamstring relationships, what I'm talking about here. So if I'm taking somebody into a bridge and their hamstrings immediately cramp, right? That happens all the time, at least in my world, it happens all the time. So one of the cues that I've been giving people lately is, okay, so instead of hamstring first, press up with the glutes, do glutes first. And a lot of times that takes care of it. Like then the hamstrings aren't doing all the work and you get, again, just work. It's another way to get that balance between glutes and hamstrings going. And in that case, I don't usually start with the glutes, but in this case I might. Look, it's press up with the glutes and then let the hamstrings come in as they come in instead of the other way around.
Yeah, that makes sense. Any exercise, wherever you put your intention, really does have a lot to do with what muscle is going to contract first and strongest.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So in the bridge, for instance, how many times have I had someone doing a bridge and they say, this bothers my knees? Well, guess what? They're pushing their leg out. It's an isometric leg extension, basically, rather than getting the posterior chain, they're getting the anterior chain. And it's usually because their posterior chain is too weak. So then you remind them, okay, I want you to pull your heels in a little bit more, push down with your heels, however you want to cue it. But it gets that posterior chain firing. And they'll say, oh yeah, now my knees don't bother me, or I'm not feeling the quads work anymore. So there's different ways. And a lot of it has to do with intention. Where you put their intention has a lot to do with it. So like you said, if you find it's the hamstrings that are the weaker, you may want to focus more on the hamstrings. If you find that it's more of their glutes, you might want to put more focus there.
Right.
Yeah.
So one other thing that I'm going to maybe cause some confusion at, we'll see. Thinking about the bridge, because the bridge relates to many, many other exercises. Thinking about the bridge, if you're doing a round back bridge, right, an articulated bridge or a bridge where you're focusing on spinal mobility, you usually start that with a posterior tilt, right? Because that's what you do. You start with the posterior tilt and then you press the hips up and you come up the top and then you come on back down. Now, there are a couple different ways to do that posterior tilt. And this is where the hamstrings and the glutes really can come into different kinds of balance. And this also relates to posture. The hamstrings, and I've seen this on a lot of clients, if the hamstrings are just dominant, you'll see that the hamstrings are literally pulling the pelvis into that posterior tilt. And sometimes the
Mm,
glutes are not active at all.
mhm,
So I think about my kind of super loose clients. I also think about my like, slung under sway back young men clients where the hamstrings are literally like pulling their sit bones to the back of their knees, but they're flat butt. There's like no butt happening there at all.
mhm,
So that's, again, I've talked a little bit about an overactive glute. This is kind of the other reason I find that gets to be an underactive glute is a lot when somebody is super posteriorly tilted and working from that posture. Just bringing them into more of an anterior tilt can sometimes get those glutes active. But sometimes you've got to really work on getting that posture to release and getting the hamstrings to, again, tone the hamstrings down, tune the glutes up to try to get a
mhm.
better balance there.
Yeah. A lot of it comes down to awareness and just
As
teaching them
usual.
postural awareness because
Yeah.
yeah, because I had a Pilates instructor in here earlier today, and she has a young child, a little over 1 year old, and obviously still carries the child, and she's fairly petite. I mean, she's very petite. Uh, and I was just looking at her, and she was complaining about her shoulders, and I said, "Well, look at where your posture is." And I said, "Here's what we need to focus on." She was really almost in a sway back posture where her ribs were behind her hips. And so
Yep.
her glutes were not firing. Her hamstrings were holding up her,
Whole body.
pelvis. Whole
Yes.
body was all in the hamstrings, and her ribs were really sitting back. By the end of the session, we did a lot of core work. We did some shoulder work. We did a lot of awareness, a lot of where is your body in space sort of thing. And by the end, her posture was great. Her glutes were firing, and things were on the way, on her way. Now, being a Pilates instructor, it was basically fine tuning what she already had. Starting someone from scratch is a whole different story. But again, it's getting that awareness and just where are you in space instead of just falling into your body like, blah, like here I am. It's okay. How am I standing? Where am I in space? And getting that awareness sometimes can get their pelvis in the right position, and suddenly their glutes are turning on better and their hamstrings are lengthening a little bit. So just getting them to do that, even for a short period of time, 10 seconds and then let it rest, 10 seconds, let it rest, can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So hopefully we've given you a lot. I feel like we had a lot of practical stuff in this session, a lot of different
Mhm.
ways to activate the glutes, to think about it, to think about range of motion, to think about what's firing, to think about when it's firing, putting it into functional context. Um, yeah.
And we may
What
have
else?
confused a few people, and I'm only going to say that in this. There's a lot of people who are going to ask, well, how do I know if something's firing or not? And I hate to
Mm,
say sometimes you're just going to have to ask the client to put their hands on their glutes if you're not a body worker and don't feel comfortable using your hands. And as a man, I'm not going to grab someone's rear end and just say, "Here, are you firing it?" Without, proper
yes.
context. But
Yes.
getting them to do it. Now, we can often see it with our, we have trained vision, but there are some
Yeah.
clients who may be a little overweight who we're not going to be able to see whether the glutes are firing or not. So we're going to have to ask them, what do they feel? You know, we can see visual cues, as you said, if when they go into hip extension, do they bend their knee? They may be hamstring dominant. If their legs stay straight, they may not be. When they lift their leg, do they dump into their low back? Their glutes may not be firing properly. These are all things that we see and we almost take for granted that we see. But these are sort of cues that I think would be good to sort of for you to note when you're working with your clients. Oh, they are dumping into their low back because you're going to see a crease right at their lumbar spine as they lift their leg up in the air.
Yeah.
And what you're going to see is the hamstring will fire. They're going to have that crease. Their glutes are going to be shut off. So these are just things that you can note whether or not it's active or not. And if it is not active, then that tells you that's really where you should probably start is that gluteal activation. And if it is
Yeah.
active, are their hamstrings active as well? Are they working? Because you want that balance.
And I find for hamstrings too, I often need to use my hands to figure out if they're firing.
Mhm.
hamstrings, people can really not use, I mean, on the other side of this, people can really not use hamstrings like for anything. And can kind of use their calves even. I've seen people do calves for knee flexion rather than really
Oh,
using the
yeah.
hamstrings, right? And then the glutes kind of for hip extension rather than the hamstrings as much. And there again, I've often got to use my hands because sometimes you can see it, sometimes you can't. If somebody's wearing leggings, I can usually tell. If they're wearing like joggers or some kind of looser pant, can't always really tell what's happening there. So another place just to, and people can't feel their back body mostly at all. I
Yes.
often use the analogy that we're kind of like paper dolls that are printed on one side. And we can, we're very aware of everything that's on that front side of the piece of paper, our abs and what they're doing in our face and even our shoulders and, whatever, and our quads. But you get to the back of the body and it literally is like a blank spot in most people's, body map or most people's brain map in terms of what their body's doing. So,
yeah, I call it mirror muscles. If we can see it in the mirror,
yep.
we have a lot more notice of it,
Connection to it.
connection.
Yes.
Yeah. What's what back there? What's that? I don't know. It's just, it follows me around. That's all it does. It's following me.
That's right.
So yeah. So hopefully we gave you some ideas on some things. I want to put one more little thing in here and let you touch on this as well. When it comes to hamstrings, I often find that one side is going to be dominant over the other, especially the lateral hamstring. And what you're going to see with the client is that tibial torsion. You're going to see that foot rotate out. You're going to see and I noticed this a lot. One exercise that I like to do is a hip extension with straight legs. Supine, it's sort of like a hip extension bridge on a ball or on a chair or something. So their legs are straight and on an elevated surface, and they're going to go into hip extension, lifting their butt off the ground. It's a great way to get the glutes activated and to get the hamstrings working. Now, what I often will see is their feet will turn out. So we're getting a lot more of that lateral hamstring rather than the medial. So for some of you, just a big challenge will be keeping the feet straight. Just keep the feet straight, or I'll put something between the toe box of their shoes. I'll put like a little yoga block and I'll say, here, squeeze this. And I'll put a light tug on it, just half a pound. I'm barely pulling it, but just enough so that they feel that there's something holding it together.
Hold it.
Oh my gosh, do you see some weakness there?
Yes.
So that balance between the glutes and hamstrings, very important, but also making sure medial and lateral hamstrings as well. We want to make sure that's balanced.
Yeah, and we haven't, again, we're gonna like the last 2 minutes here. But yeah, and how I talk about that a lot in terms of that exactly. And my test for that, Brian, is super simple. It's like being prone. And there's a single leg kick and prone single leg kicks in Pilates. But basically, even just being prone and bend your knee from that prone position. And for most people, that lower leg is going to turn out immediately, right? That foot is going to be pointing 45 degrees to the corner. And that lets me know that the lateral hamstring is dominant, right? Yep. So again, just keeping that parallel is like, whoa. And then I'll also do a lot, if I'm doing feet in straps or anything else, I'll focus on medial rotation rather than lateral rotation for all those things. And I'll, even have the toes turned in, or I'll have let's say a ring at the ankles and pushing into that ring in internal rotation as they're going up and down. And all those are going to get that medial hamstring going, because it's not in American Western culture, it's not very common to have strong medial hamstrings.
Yeah.
So more on that, I think, another session.
I was going to say, I think we have another topic for down the road. I like this. I like this. I was just thinking about that. So thank you guys very much. Hopefully we gave you some things to think about. As always, do please hit the like and subscribe button. We really appreciate it. Comment, share, do all those sorts of things. We love it when you do. And you can reach us at movingcombos@gmail.com. Moving Combos on Instagram is where you can also see us, and check out our Anatomy Minis. We're also putting out a bunch of shorts on YouTube. So check us out and give us some comments on that. We really appreciate it. And for Nora St. John, I'm Brian Ritchie. We'll see y'all next week.
Bye, guys.